Hi, this is Harry Margolis, host of Risking Old Age in America.
In this podcast, I have a fascinating discussion with Israel Doron, chair of the Department of Gerontology at the University of Haifa in Israel, about the differences in the systems of elder care in our two countries. Unlike the United States, Israel provides up to 20 hours a week of free home health care for all but its most affluent residents. Most Israelis also have long-term care insurance for expenses over and above this base. Professor Doron expresses astonishment that the United States does not have universal health insurance like other developed nations. Here's our conversation.
Welcome, Issi.
Hi, pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
So, I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us how you got into working on aging issues.
So once again, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Issi, Professor Israel Doron. I'm based at the University of Haifa in Israel at the Department of Gerontology, but right now, currently, I'm a visiting professor at the Department of Gerontology here at UMass Boston. And it's an opportunity for me to thank them for hosting me and to thank Boston for allowing me to enjoy the city. I'm a lawyer in my background. I'm a legal scholar, but fortunately, I was exposed to the field of law and aging and to the field of aging actually in the United States. I did my master's degree in Washington, D.C. at Washington College of Law in international humanitarian rights and international humanitarian law. And I was interested in human rights. And part of the program was to be sent to do an internship in a human rights organization. And I was sent to AARP, their Legal Counsel of the Elderly. And at that time, I had no idea about elder law, no idea about human rights of older persons, and generally no idea about aging whatsoever. It was in the early 1990s. I was still a relatively young person. And
Had not experienced aging yourself?
No. And like many Israelis, unfortunately, because I was a son of a Holocaust survivors, I didn't experience grandparent from my personal family. So I was suddenly exposed to this whole new world of aging and elder law and basically fell in love, went back to Israel and decided that that's going to be my career. At that time in Israel, there was no knowledge about this field. And basically from then on, I developed my expertise eventually through academia, did my PhD in Toronto in elder guardianship, studied the field of guardianship of older adults. And since then, I've been active on the both national and international arena in promoting a new international human rights convention for older persons.
So, well, why don't you tell us something about that? So
Okay.
What is that and why do we need that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. Unlike women, children, persons with disabilities, and other minority or disadvantaged groups, older persons are the only social group that does not have a unique and dedicated international human rights convention on the UN level. And for at least 25 years, there have been calls and research and studies about the normative gap that exists in international human rights law with regards to older persons. So, for example, many of the traditional human rights covenants do not include age as such as a distinct criteria, for example, in the context of equality or discrimination. Age discrimination is not mentioned as such. And ageism, the whole phenomena of the negative stereotype and its impact on older persons had very little visibility on the international human rights arena. So there has been an ongoing struggle in an attempt to advance such a new convention. And we are living in fascinating times because in 2010, the UN established what is known as the Open-Ended Working Group, which worked for 14 years, met every year in New York in the headquarters of the UN. And about 2 years ago, it failed to reach a consensus and moved the discussions to Geneva, to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years, the Human Rights Council decided to start to draft a new international human rights convention for older persons. And this year, 2 months ago, I was in Geneva in the opening session, beginning the drafting process of this new convention. So this is really a fascinating time because right now, as we speak, the United Nations Human Rights Council is working on the drafting process of a new convention, which I would like to believe that would have an important and significant impact in promoting the human rights of older persons around the world.
Interesting. So I guess it makes some sense to do it now because there are going to be a lot more older people.
Absolutely.
Just with demographics. But I think in the United States, we're not so familiar with some of these things because we live on our side of the ocean and we're big and we do our own thing and we don't pay much attention to the United Nations or its various councils. So what's the impact of this kind of thing outside of the United States?
Yeah, United States is a fascinating story on that behalf. It's a mixed bag, so to speak. On the one hand, the United States is certainly a leader in the field of law and aging. The United States was the first country in the world to legislate the Older Americans Act, or a specific piece of legislation fully dedicated to older persons as such. I would allow myself to mention both the ABA, Commission on Law and Aging, and NAELA, National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. So the whole field of elder law. Again, I was fortunate to be exposed to really significant leading persons in the field, including you, Harry, that have basically developed this whole field of law and aging in the United States. And since then, it has spread around the world. But certainly, the US has been a champion in developing the field of law and aging. On the other hand, unfortunately, the United States historically didn't pay much attention to international law, because of historical and political reasons, amongst other, the notion that this doesn't have anything to learn from the world in the context of human rights. It can teach the world, and for other political reasons, which it's not the topic of our conversation. So unfortunately, even in the context of the current debates around the new convention for older persons, the US generally said that it will not support. Again, it's not specifically about older person. It's part of broader political stance that US doesn't support and does not join these international human rights conventions. But I would say that it would have an impact on the US as well. We have seen it, for example, on the CRPD, the Convention of Rights of All Persons with Disabilities, or CEDAW, the Convention with regard to women, that these international human rights convention, even if they are not adopted directly by the United States, the American jurisprudence and scholarship is definitely influenced and relates to these new conventions. So it will have also an impact with regards to older persons in the United States as well.
So, yeah, I would think if we see what's happening in the rest of the world and we're doing something different, it could have some impact, at least for advocates who are saying, why don't we at least give older people in the U.S. or other categories who have human rights conventions already the same benefits they would have outside of the United States?
Right.
So switching gears a bit, so we talked before, you and I, about the difference between Israel and the United States in terms of elder care, how it's provided, how it's paid for. So I wonder if you talk a little bit about how that all works in Israel.
Yeah. So undoubtedly, elder care is a challenge all across the world. So it's not the challenges that the United States is dealing with its aging population is common in most developed countries across the world, including Israel. So I will share 3 key issues there that we have talked about in Israel and how it compares to the United States. So the first point is the fact that Israel, unlike the United States, has what is known as universal healthcare coverage. So every resident of Israel, basically from birth to death, is covered by a universal healthcare coverage and basically has healthcare. So unlike the US, and I'm not talking about the older adults, but the general population, which needs to have some kind of a private insurance or other kinds of needs-based healthcare, that's not the case in Israel. Now, I know that in the United States, and we talked about it, the federal program of Medicare does provide a sort of a universal healthcare for older adults. However, as we know, aging is a life course issue. So if in your 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, you didn't receive adequate health care, when you reach your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's in some perspectives a little bit too late. So the first issue is that the fact that Israel does have a universal healthcare coverage as a starting point provides a better starting point for older adults in the sense that when they reach the age of 65 or 67, they have experienced a relatively adequate and good healthcare coverage on a universal basis, which has a starting point which may be a little bit better than some Americans who couldn't have afforded an adequate healthcare in their earlier years. So when you're old in Israel, you have a universal healthcare coverage, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's one element. The second element, which is used to be unique to Israel, is that Israel was one of the first countries in the world that legislated and anchored in its legislation, in its social security legislation, what we called community-based long-term care insurance. So broadly speaking and generally speaking, every resident of Israel who paid the social insurance, social security, once in old age, again, broadly speaking, there's a quite high needs assessment, but it's 1.5 times the average income. So most of the vast majority of older adults in Israel are entitled to receive that community-based.
So you're saying everybody gets it unless their income is over
right.
1.5 times average income for all Israelis.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So, which is quite a high threshold, which means that the vast majority of older Israelis are entitled to receive, which basically entitles around 20 or more weekly hours of in-home care, which is quite and other community-based services. So, for example, daycare and other kinds of community-based services, which have significantly shifted the mode of care to home care and community-based long care, based on the fact that the vast majority of older persons who are in need for some kinds of assistance or the activities of daily living can receive this home care and community-based as part of their entitlement to social insurance. So they don't have to pay it out of their pocket, which was a huge success, and it's still a very big success as a social insurance program in Israel, which provides a significant community-based services to older adults with need for functional assistance on daily living, and which has been mirrored in the significant decline in institutional care in the last 20 or 30 years, due to the fact that more Israelis can receive an appropriate care in the community.
So this program wasn't always available.
No, it was enacted in the 1980s. Basically, it started to take force. It was one of the first such programs in the world at the time. Since then, many countries, again, developed countries around the world, has, so to speak, adopted similar programs and added it to the traditional social insurance and social security programs as part of a national coverage to basically to give answers to the rising needs of the aging populations. And from a financial perspective, only realizations that it's an interesting topic, but generally speaking, it's not much, but it's cheaper and more financially viable to provide the care for older adults in the community, and that's what they prefer, rather than to opt to traditional institutional based long-term care services, which are quite expensive, quite extensive, and many times that's not what older people really want.
So who provides the care? So this 20 hours a week, is it like a local social service agency that hires people to provide the care, or how does that all work?
Yeah, so once again, this is a fascinating issue and a challenge. To begin with, like the US and like most of developed countries, the vast majority of care for older adults is provided by family members. So that's the foundation, and it doesn't matter which system you are, that's still in the vast majority of the world. Family members and informal care are the ones who are the initial point of reference to provide care. But once we move into the community-based long-term services, for example, then we are moving into more people who are professional or semi-professionals in the sense that it's a low-paid work. So many times it's at least in Israel, the workforce in these fields are mostly women, many times in older ages, actually. In Israel, many times we had, after the fall of the former Soviet Union, we had a significant immigration of Jews from the former Soviet Union to Israel. So there used to be a very significant portion of the care force were adult women or even older women from the former Soviet Union who entered into this field of elder care and provided care. Even in later years, so it's not uncommon to see women in their 60s or 70s from the former Soviet Union who provide care as care workers under our social insurance scheme, provide care for older Israelis. There is a fascinating subsector of foreign workers, migrant workers from Asia, from Nepal, from the Philippines, come to Israel and basically provide 24/7 care for older adults at home, which is another niche. And you have, again, a subgroup of Arab Israelis who, once again, work in this field. Unfortunately, it's a low-paid, not easy work to do, quite challenging. So usually these would be the population who would be working in these fields.
But they're able to find enough workers to even at that compensation level.
It's becoming more and more challenging. Israel has relied on foreign workers, on migrant workers, and it has become a challenge, especially in the last few years, beginning from the COVID-19 and then in the recent war. It has been more and more challenging to find workers in the field. The responses for this challenge was actually to change the regulation and allow for under the social insurance to actually pay for family members who provide care for their elder relatives. So one of the new options, which is only a very recent development, because of the shortage in workforce, basically they allowed care companies to employ family members and to pay them under the social insurance scheme while providing care to their older relatives, something that was not allowed and not permitted until a few years ago. So
you say care companies. Are these for-profit or non-profit?
Yeah,
Care companies?
there are both. There are non-for-profit organizations and there are for-profit organizations. There is actually a competition. So an older adult in Israel can choose, he has the right to choose between the care company which will provide the care. So it's a competition based on quality. In some areas in Israel, the non-for-profit organizations are better and provide better care and have better schemes. And in other parts, it's the for-profit organizations and companies. So it's an open market, it's a competitive market, and it's a challenging market.
Interesting. So that covers this 20 hours of home care. And what happens if somebody needs more care than that?
Yeah. That's the real challenge. The answer is the natural challenge is the natural answer is family members. Again, the whole notion of the community-based long-term care is that, again, and I started from that, is that the person has a family that basically provides the basic care. So, 20 hours a week, that means around 3 hours a day. But these 3 hours a day are quite crucial and substantial because this is the amount of time that allows the family member to go out, relax a little bit, maybe go to work half time but as you say, if the amount of care and support that the older adult is beyond that, or 3 or 4 hours a day does not provide the full needs, and there is no family members which can add up and provide the full care, unfortunately, in those cases, the answer would be either a migrant worker, so 24/7 in-home, which is not fully covered by the social insurance scheme. So the person will have to pay out of pocket and has to have the resources, the financial resources to pay the additional cost of a migrant worker. Or the alternative would be, unfortunately, institutional care. Now, in Israel, institutional long-care term is not part of our universal healthcare coverage. That to the extent that you reach a point that the community long-term care services are not sufficient and the family members are unable to provide the care, or there are no family members, or they are abusive, then once you have to go to an institutional care, then it's a needs-based scheme. So if you have the finance or the money, like the US, you have to pay on your own and basically become impoverished. If you don't have the money, then Israel has a very unique system of filial responsibility law, which is quite unique.
Oh,
So,
really?
so basically the Ministry of Health would go to the children, the adult children of the adult. They have a needs-based scheme, so they will examine the income of the adult children of that person.
Wow.
And if they have sufficient income, they will have to co-pay to the cost. And only if the older person himself or herself and the adult children, if they exist, do not have sufficient funds, only then will the Ministry of Health fund and cover the full cost of institutional care. It's needs-based, and basically it's up to you to fund your institutional care. And only if you're really poor, then you will be able to cover, only then will the state come in and cover the cost. I would have to add one more point, which is very relevant, which is interesting in comparison to the US. Israel is one of the countries that was very successful in promoting private insurance of long-term care. So in addition to the social insurance, universal community-based long-term care system, Israel has quite, I think, one of the most extensive long-term care insurance, which basically, I think the majority of older Israelis are covered by this private scheme, which is limited. It provides to up to between 3 and 5 years and up to a limit. So it's not, it's always limited financially, but nevertheless, it gives another safety net for middle class and upper class that in the case of need for institutional care, this private insurance can provide and cover a significant amount of the cost, even if you are not poor or impoverished. Yeah.
So that is very different from the U.S. in a lot of ways. So you have the basic coverage, and then you have the insurance, and the needs-based insurance for institutional care is more like the U.S., except for the added gloss of the filial responsibility that comes as a surprise to a lot of children of older people in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know that many years in the United States, there was an effort to try to promote private long-term care insurances. And to the best of my knowledge, and you can correct me, it didn't succeed, or at least it wasn't successful.
No, I think when they originally started it, their iterating was just wrong. And so it turned out to be a lot more expensive, or a lot more claims than they expected. And then they raised the price, and then the premiums, and then it became too expensive for most people.
Right. And again, Israel is the unique story or example in that case, because to the best of my knowledge, private long-term care insurance programs were not successful in many places, exactly because of the reasons you have mentioned. But in Israel, however, it was successful, maybe because it was like an addition programs that the healthcare providers in Israel have took upon themselves. So it's as part of like an additional scheme beyond a universal basket of services. So maybe because
Right.
of
I
that.
think that makes a lot of sense because you don't
Yeah.
need to buy as much
Right.
because you have a certain level that's covered as a right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. One is I looked up the median age in Israel as compared to the U.S. and
Yeah.
it's 29 years in Israel and a full decade. We're a full decade older at 39. And I wonder how that impacts everything. Clearly,
Yeah.
as older people in Israel must be a smaller percentage.
Yeah. Again, Israel is a unique story. One of the uniquenesses of my country is birth rate. Unlike most of the Western and developed world, which birth rates are declining significantly, and in many countries are even below two babies per woman, that means that the population is declining. In Israel, our fertility rate is almost 3 children per woman. So we have, and again, we have subpopulations which have much
Well, I
higher
was
rates.
wondering if that is mostly among the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox.
Not only, no, it's even myself, I have 3 children, and it's very common to have 3 or 4 children, even in non-Orthodox Jewish section of the Israeli society. So we have high fertility rates. The meaning of the outcome of high fertility rate is twofold. One, as you say, the mean age is much lower than the US. And as you can mention, the informal support network for older adults is much bigger. But however, you have to keep in mind that the life expectancy in Israel is quite high. I think we're something like 4th or 5th place in the world with regard to life expectancy at birth. So paradoxically, despite of all our challenges, so to speak, in the Middle East, we have a very high life expectancy. We have, generally speaking, quite good lifestyle. So we have Mediterranean food, and we have Mediterranean weather, and we have nice sun and climate, and we have a very family-oriented society. So you are correct. Statistically, our mean age is lower. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have the challenges of aging society. We do. But like you say, percentage-wise, the older population in Israel is around 13%, which is much lower than the US in many developed countries. And because of the relatively larger number of children, the informal support network for older adults is much stronger and larger. We're also a very small country. So unlike the US, which you have a challenge as an older person who lives in Boston and your children are in LA and one child is in Texas, just on the technical ability to take care. In Israel, our size of the country is so small that in the worst case scenario, a 2.5-hour drive in a car from one place to the other. So we have a very strong culture of family support, and which certainly for many older adults, not everyone, but for many older adults, provides a much better or easier or larger informal support network in old age.
And a little less pressure on the kids if there's more of them to share the burden.
Right, exactly. Yes.
Yep. And then I know we know a lot going on in Israel in terms of conflict, and there are a lot of Palestinian Israelis as well. Do they receive all the same benefits as Jewish Israelis?
Yeah, again, it's beyond the topic of this conversation, but again, as many listeners may well aware, in Israel, there's around 22 or 23% of the population is Arab Palestinians, a non-Jewish population. Israel is a liberal democracy. All Jews and non-Jews in Israel receive exactly the same rights and the same entitlements. And there's a whole range of the same rights and entitlements Jews receive and non-Jews and Arab Palestinians receive. This is an interesting point from a cultural perspective in 2 ways. One, historically, unlike the Jewish community, the Arab Palestinian community historically didn't use institutional care. Older persons culturally were provided care in home as part of a multi-generational living arrangement. And it's still very common if you go to an Arab village in Israel to find in one house 3 floors. On the first floor, the grandparents, the second floor, the children, and the third floor, the grandchildren, everybody living together in the same household physically and providing care to each other on a multi-generational kind of setting. This is changing because the Arab community is going through processes of modernization, so the young generation is a little bit different, but historically the Arab Palestinian minority culturally took care of their older persons within the community, physically within the house. So there were almost no institutional settings in the Arab communities, but this is changing. And again, we can certainly see how the Arab minority is going through processes of modernization. And through these processes, similar challenges that the Jewish or more modern section of the Israeli society has been dealing for many years are now starting to be dealt by, and historically didn't have to deal with them, but now they are.
That's an interesting phenomenon. So interesting. So I always end my conversations with the same two questions, and are similar, at least they're similar in each case. So from what you know of the U.S. elder care system, if you were going to make one recommendation to policymakers here, what would that be?
I thought about this question, and I want to be non-original, and again, it's not elder specific, but anyone who comes from abroad and grew up in a country with universal healthcare system and experiences the issues in the United States or a country that doesn't have a universal healthcare system, it always astonishes me how can it be that a modern country like the US doesn't have such a system. It's not the topic of this conversation, but I've started it in one of your first questions. Aging is a life course perspective. So the healthcare you receive and the health conditions that you go through in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s are going to directly influence on your life in your 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so important to have these healthcare systems in younger ages. So even if you do have, and assuming you have a relatively generous Medicare, I'm not saying that that's the case, but even if Medicare is very generous, it will not be able to solve the accumulated health issues that a person developed throughout that stage. So if I only had one proposition is to make the U.S. to a country that has a good, and you have an excellent healthcare. If you have the money, you have an outstanding healthcare. But if most people cannot afford those services, then it's and you pay the price in old age.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the life expectancy of someone who's rich in the U.S. and someone who's poor, they measure this by quintiles, is about a 10-year difference.
Absolutely. And by the way, that's one of the reasons the U.S. is not faring that well from an international comparative perspective on the average life expectancy.
Yeah.
Exactly because of that.
Yeah. So if you're going to make one recommendation to seniors or their families in the United States, what would that be? Other than move to a country like Israel with universal health care.
No, I'm not saying move the country. I'm saying change the country.
I know. But
and regarding, once again, this is a very challenging question, but I will have to go to my legal background and to my lawyer fundamentals. I'm a true believer in planning to old age. As an elder law attorney, as a human rights perspective, I think that planning to old age is something that can be done in so many ways. So, and again, planning needs to start earlier, but you can still do a lot of planning even once you're a senior citizen or in old age. So I would recommend, and that's what actually we do as part of the convention, is to try to implement the ideology of preventive law, therapeutic jurisprudence on relational autonomy in the sense of talking about old age, planning to old age, having the legal and healthcare instruments and the financial elements that once you reach old age, and if you happen to live until your 80s or 90s, regardless of what happens to you, you have planned in advance, so you have the solutions, answer, and the adequate foundations to be taken care of appropriately, and that your wishes and preferences would be maintained at old age. So that's my recommendation, so to speak.
I think it's a good one. This has been very enlightening for me, Issi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very thankful.
Thank you for listening to my discussions with experts about the challenges facing the United States as our population ages, along with possible solutions. You can visit my blog on these topics at okboomer.substack.com. And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for other topics or speakers, please email me at harry@margolis.com.